I do solemnly, sincerely, truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles, his heirs and successors, according to law.
Thank you.
When the Labour Party's Sir Keir Starmer was elected as Prime Minister of Britain last month, he planned to tackle some of the long-term issues that have been plaguing his country. His first priorities included reviving a stagnant economy and repairing the struggling National Health Service. Now he faces a more immediate and unexpected problem, one that is proving to be his government's first major domestic test. England and Northern Ireland have been rocked by a week of anti-immigrant riots that have gripped more than a dozen cities. The riots came in the wake of a knife attack on a children's dance class in the town of Southport, close to Liverpool, which left 3 young girls dead. Subsequently, there were large-scale violence across Middle and Northern England, much of which initially was driven by misinformation about the identity of the attacker. It was initially claimed that the attacker was a Muslim immigrant. That turned out to be false. But that made little difference as the misinformation went viral online, both on private messaging channels as well as social media platforms like X. The attacker was identified as Axel Rudakabana. He was born and raised in Britain, and according to the BBC, his parents were from Rwanda. But because of these large-scale and sudden riots, Starmer and his government suddenly find themselves fighting a two-pronged battle. On the one hand, there is the online battle, and on the other, in the streets where rioters have rampaged in more than 15 towns and cities, injuring dozens of police officers, looting businesses, targeting mosques, and setting fire outside a hotel which had asylum seekers. So far, Keir Starmer has taken a law and order first approach. After all, he's been a chief prosecutor before he became Prime Minister. He has vowed to crack down on perpetrators and bring them swiftly to justice. He's also promised to put more police out on the streets and provide additional security personnel to Muslim communities and to mosques. And so far, he has mostly avoided attacks from his political opponents. In fact, his opponents have moved to unite in opposition to condemn the violence. But Starmer does face a challenge in dealing with the disorder which has badly shaken communities, partly because he's inherited an overwhelmed criminal justice system. The government has said it would fast-track hearings for those who are charged in connection with the riots, but the prison system has been operating at full capacity even before the violence began. The situation was so bad that the new government had already introduced emergency early release measures for those who are non-violent offenders. People in the UK have got reduced trust in policing nationally, along with deep cuts to community policing which happened during the Conservative Party's rule. All of this has also made it harder for police officers to deal with public disorder. And the courts, which were already overwhelmed by their caseloads with a serious backlog at all levels of the court, are now struggling to address the tens who've been arrested and subject them to the legal process. It is unclear whether the limit on prison spaces will be exceeded before the government is finished cracking down on the rioters. And if that were to happen, whether or not officials will be forced to let go of some people quickly and before their time ends. The government has made it quite clear that their ambitions are there to tackle some of these longer-term problems, but it's going to take time, and it makes this really difficult to deal with in the immediate term.
If you target people because of the colour of their skin or their faith, then that is far right, and I'm prepared to say so. But it doesn't matter what apparent motivation there is.
Starmer has called this far-right thuggery and has vowed a swift crackdown. Nearly 400 people have been arrested so far, and the police say they will track down others who they know were involved in the riots and fomenting hate online and arrest them immediately.
People in this country have a right to be safe, and yet we've seen Muslim communities targeted, attacks on mosques, other minority communities singled out, Nazi salutes in the street, attacks on the police, wanton violence alongside racist rhetoric. So no, I won't shy away from calling it what it is: far-right thuggery.
Speaking after an emergency meeting earlier this week with government ministers, police representatives, civil servants, and the intelligence services, Starmer announced a plan for a standing army of specialized police officers whose only job will be to deal with disorder. He said, and I quote, "This is not a protest, this is pure violence, and we will not tolerate attacks on our mosques or on our Muslim communities." He went on to say that the full force of the law will be visited on those who have been identified as having taken part in these activities. Now, mainstream politicians, even those who believe that illegal immigration is a major problem in the UK, so far have remained united in their condemnation of the violence. Members of the previous Conservative government have voiced unqualified support to the government. Rishi Sunak, the former Prime Minister and the current leader of the Conservatives, who pushed for a much criticised plan to ship asylum seekers to Rwanda, called the latest round of violence criminal behaviour which has no place in British society. Priti Patel, a former Conservative Home Secretary who introduced some of the country's most stringent laws on asylum seekers, said in a letter to the current Home Secretary that this is a moment for national reflection and solidarity, to pull back from the wave of violence and to call it out for what it is, and for Parliament to speak with one voice in condemnation. Even tabloid newspapers that typically take aim at the Labour government have focused more on the mayhem and less on criticising Starmer's government. Some Conservatives, though, have urged Mr. Starmer to recall Parliament from its summer recess so that lawmakers can have more of a say in how to respond. James Cleverly, a Conservative lawmaker and a former Home Secretary, told British news outlets that the government was slow off the mark in dealing with these riots.
We haven't organised this very well, have we?
But for the most part, any criticism has been indirect or muted, save for a few detractors like Nigel Farage, the leader of the populist right-wing party Reform UK. Last week, Farage put out a video questioning the official information about the attacker, which he said gave air to some conspiracy theories. On Monday, earlier this week, he did condemn the violence, but then he criticized what he said was Starmer's faltering attempts to address the violence.
At no point in the last week or in the previous 30 years have I ever encouraged the use of violence. Have I ever encouraged the use of anti-democratic means.
Prime Minister Keir Starmer has also called out online companies directly after false information about the identity of the 17-year-old suspect in the attack, which spread initially rapidly on many of these social media platforms. These rumors refuse to die down, no matter how many times the police and government officials push back against these claims. Immediately after the attack, false claims began circulating about the perpetrator, including that he was an asylum seeker from Syria. In fact, the suspect was born in Cardiff, he'd lived in Britain all his life, and according to both the BBC and the Times of London, his parents are from Rwanda. The misinformation was amplified by far-right agitators who have large online followings, and many of them use messaging apps like Telegram or X to call people to protest against this. Clashes followed in several towns across the UK, leading to more than 50 police officers being injured in Southport and over 100 arrests in and around London. There was even a viral spat between the British Prime Minister and the owner of X, billionaire Elon Musk. Starmer accused Musk of adding fuel to the fire by giving more credence to these conspiracy theories. Musk was defiant and he refused to take down his posts. Officials fear more violence in the days ahead. The viral falsehoods were so prevalent that a judge took the unusual step of lifting restrictions and named who the underage suspect was. He was identified as Axel Rudukubana. Policing the internet is a legally murky terrain for most democracies, because you have individual rights and free speech protections which have to be balanced against a desire to block harmful content. Last year, Britain adopted a law called the Online Safety Act, which requires social media companies to introduce new protections for child safety, while at the same time also forcing companies to prevent and rapidly remove any illegal content which is like terrorism propaganda or revenge pornography. But the law is less clear about how companies must treat misinformation or incendiary and xenophobic language. Instead, the law gives the British agency Ofcom, which oversees television and other traditional media formats, more authority to regulate online platforms. So far, though, the agency has not taken much action to tackle this issue. In the longer term, analysts say that the government will have its task cut out, not just with dealing with the law and order, but also how to promote community cohesion in a society that feels increasingly divided. Britain has long prided itself in multiculturalism, but that has not come to pass, certainly not the way that most Britons have expected it to. For the last 25 years, under successive governments, there have been discussions about having a proper strategy for promoting cohesion and integration in Britain. But for a long time, the focus was on combating Muslim extremism and radicalization, particularly in the wake of terror attacks in the noughties that happened in both Britain as well as in the United States. But that does not take away from some British people's real frustrations regarding immigration. It is important to distinguish between what some British people feel as their vocal frustration around immigration and, of course, the violence that the rioters indulged in and the disrepute that they brought to their communities. Painting both the rioters and the people that they claim to speak for with the same brush would be a criminal mistake.